Hello and welcome to my first members Q&A video. This is an idea I came up with when I set up memberships on my channel. If you're not aware of what memberships are, I'm sure you must have seen some of the little adverts I put on my other videos explaining it, but just in case you haven't, basically if you become a member of the channel and it starts from just 99 pence a month, then you get to be in the Members Hall of Fame, like you can see these nice guys on the screen at the moment, and also you get a bunch of perks, and depending on what level you come in at, level 1, 2 or 3, you get different perks. So if you'd like to add yourself to that Hall of Fame and become a member, you just need to click on the join button below any of my videos and you get information about how to sign up. In terms of having a chance to ask questions in this members Q&A, the idea was that level 3 members get 3 questions, level 2 members get 1 question, and level 1 members don't get any questions. But because I haven't got that many members at the moment, I actually opened the chance to ask me questions to all members. Unfortunately, my one level 3 member, Old Scott Retro, didn't actually submit any questions. I've not heard anything from him for a while, so I hope he's okay. If you're out there, Old Scott Retro, please let me know you're alright. So that definitely meant that I could ask questions to my level 1 members, and they've submitted a few for me. Let's get this Q&A underway then, and I should mention that I said to my members that you can ask me any kind of question. It doesn't necessarily have to be about gaming, although most of them obviously are. So I'm going to kick things off with a question from Warren Pilkinson, aka Zor Towers, or Was, who's been a strong supporter of my channel for a long time and has even been involved in a couple of videos. And he asked, would you ever consider revisiting some of the Mastertronic games and doing an update to a Mastertronic Chronicles episode with the newer capture equipment? So what I was referring to here is my old Mastertronic Chronicles videos, some of which are over 10 years old now. They are not in the best quality, shall we say. The earliest ones were done with an SD camera. I later moved to an HD camera, but all of them are done by pointing the camera at the screen while I talk over them, so the quality isn't the best. In terms of whether I'd consider revisiting them, yes, the answer in short is yes, I would, but actually no, because I've got too many other things I want to be doing and I haven't really got enough time to be going back to doing the same videos again. I also wonder what the value of that would be in terms of, viewership for the channel. That's less of a concern. If I wanted to review one of those games again, I would do if I really felt that I wanted to. But yeah, I have obviously featured Mastertronic games in some of my other videos. For example, the Budget Publisher Showdown featured quite a few Mastertronic games, so there's better quality of them there. And I am going to be doing, sometime in the future, an all-time top 20 Commodore 64 budget games video, so there'll be some Mastertronic games in that obviously as well. The one thing I would quite like to do is do a Mastertronic Chronicles series for a different system, and the one that I'd really like to try is the Commodore 16, because I know there's a good range of Mastertronic games on that. Unfortunately, I don't have one and they're quite expensive, so I have got my eye out for a C16 or a Plus 4, and if I got one then that's what I'd be doing. I'd basically do Mastertronic Chronicles and possibly Firebird as well for the Commodore 16. So you never know, but I don't have any strong plans to buy a Commodore 16 unless I see one at the sort of price I'm willing to pay for it. The next question comes from another of my long-time supporters, that's Avant1277, and he asked, what's the most unusual place you bought a computer game back in the day? And he also gave me a story which I'm going to recount to some extent here about himself. He said growing up, Southampton was the nearest town to him, and he made it his mission to find every place you could browse some computer games. And the most obscure was a small haberdashery-style shop in East Street selling things related to knitting and whatnot. At the back they had a small selection of some faded tapes, mainly by Solar Software, Atlantis and Mastertronic, and those games had such old-fashioned designs that they seemed from a different age, because he was looking at these between 1986 and 88, and most of those games came out in 83 and 84. And he rounded off by saying one of the cool things about gaming in the 80s was all the weird places you could find games, especially budget games. Well, I can't really think of any particularly unusual places that I bought games from back in the day, but I did certainly pick up budget games from supermarkets. I remember the very first game I ever bought, which was Kane for the BBC Micro, I bought from the VG supermarket in my local village, which is still there, but it's actually a Spar now. And also in a town called Longton near to where I live, there was a Co-op hypermarket, and I definitely remember buying some Mastertronic games from there as well while my mum was doing her shopping. That supermarket was knocked down sometime in the 2000s and is now a massive shopping area with a huge Tesco on it. There are also a couple of computer shops that I frequented quite a lot in the late 80s and early 90s where I got most of my Commodore 64 and later PC games from. These were in Stoke-on-Trent city centre, which is actually called Hanley. I won't start explaining all about all the different towns in Stoke in this video, but these two shops had an interesting fate, shall we say. There was nothing special about them at the time in terms of location, but much later on some interesting things happened to them. The first of these two shops was Castle Computers, which was on a street called Hope Street on the outskirts of the town. And it was a pretty good shop this. It had loads of reasonably priced games. I certainly remember getting Shoot 'em Up construction kit from there for just $4.99, so that was a bargain. And I probably spent most of my money in this shop because the prices tended to be a little bit lower than the other computer shops in the area. And they had several arcade machines in the back room as well. I remember playing WWF Superstars particularly on those. So what's interesting about this shop is that Hope Street later became a bit of a dodgy area in Stoke-on-Trent. It's where all the ladies of ill repute hang out in the evenings. I don't know if that's still true, but it certainly was in the late 90s and early 2000s. And there's also a lot of dodgy sex shops down there as well. So it's interesting that area at the time when I was going to Castle Computers was pretty reasonable, but certainly become more debauched, shall we say, in the subsequent years. And the second shop that had an interesting fate was called Cursor, and this was more of a early 90s shop. I remember going in there looking for PC games. I think probably it was there earlier than that. I don't really remember buying many Commodore 64 games from there. But this is an interesting one. It was in a shopping precinct which was closed down and boarded up in the sort of mid-2000s, I would say. But then that shopping precinct was actually used to film some scenes for a zombie movie in 2016 called The Girl with All the Gifts, which was based on a book. Now, the story of this film is that the zombies are actually just normal people who've been infected with the cordyceps fungus, and it turns out that there's a girl that's immune to this fungus, and some people are transporting her to a place of safety or something along those lines. I have watched it, but I can't exactly remember the plot. What's interesting about that plot is it's almost exactly the same as the popular PS3 game The Last of Us, which was also adapted into a TV series recently. Anyway, towards the end of that film, there's a showdown between the humans and the zombies in a shopping precinct, and in the background you can actually still see the sign for Cursor a good 10 to 15 years after it closed. It's only very briefly seen in a couple of shots, but I will try and get a bit of footage of that and put it in this video. The next question comes from PXL Cool, or Pixel Cool, I'm not quite sure exactly how to pronounce that. And I know he is a big fan of my BBC Micro typing games series. He actually gave me a very large super thanks contribution recently, so thank you very much for that. He said, I was thinking about your comments about ways of typing could be improved on the BBC typing episodes, and he asked the question, is there a commercial game, or a top 3, that really stood out with regards to being an example of it could have been fantastic if only they did this, whether that be solving flickery sprites, missing gameplay elements, or too slow or fast. He was specifically thinking BBC or Electron, but it could be any of the 8-bit machines really. So you asked for a top 3, and I've actually come up with 4 different games that fit this criteria for me, 2 for the BBC Micro and 2 for the Commodore 64. The first of those games is Savage Pond for the BBC Micro, which I think was released by Bug Byte. This is quite an interesting idea. You play a tadpole in a pond, it's a single screen thing, and you have to collect things, and eventually the pond evolves and things get more challenging and so on. But the problem with this one is the collision detection on the BBC Micro version. I think this was released for some other systems, but I've never played it on any other system. But on the Beeb, your little tadpole will swim right up to certain items, you're right in line with them, and he still doesn't pick them up, and you can actually then approach them from another direction and still not pick them up. So that makes it really challenging, especially as you have to collect certain items to make progression in the game. The particular problem is that there's a dragonfly that flies overhead periodically and drops an egg, and if you don't eat that egg before it reaches the bottom of the pond, it turns into a dragonfly larva that chases you around and is very hard to avoid. But because of the collision detection, it's quite easy to miss collecting that egg because it's dropping down the screen quite quickly. It then gets to the bottom and it usually sits below some plants that are lethal to the touch, so it's almost impossible to eat it before it hatches and the larva escapes off the side of the screen. The other problem is quite often if you lose a life, there's another egg dropping down the screen which then hits the bottom and you can't collect again. So you're getting this infinite loop, or not very infinite because you only get 3 lives, but basically you lose a life, another dragonfly larva hatches, you lose another life and so on, and the game's over really quickly. So just an improvement in that collision detection, and perhaps not allowing another dragonfly larva to chase you just after one's just killed you, or not making the plants at the bottom of the screen lethal to begin with. Any of those things would make the game a little bit more accessible than it was. The next game that sprung to mind for answering this question was one that I've played in the Silverbird Selection series. It's The Prince, which was obviously released by Firebird, and this game was very ambitious to say the least. It's kind of a Zelda RPG style game, so you've got an overworld map, You've got random encounters with enemies and also dungeons that you fall into to move around and collect various items. And the problem with it is it's probably too ambitious for the hardware that it's being run on. It's really slow at times. Certainly moving around the forests and mountains on the overworld map is excruciatingly slow, and also any of the random encounters you fall into, once you've fought off the enemies you can move around to collect gold and things like that, but again the character moves so slowly that it's just excruciating. When you finally fall into one of the dungeons, the platforming levels there are actually reasonably playable, but getting to that point is really hard work. When I played the game it also seemed quite buggy, as sometimes it seemed to randomly reset or just throw you out of a dungeon when you hadn't completed it. So that one was very much a case of the developer's ambition outweighing the capability of the machine. Moving back to the BBC Micro, another game I thought of was Nutcracker, which was released by Software Projects in 1984. This game's a horizontally scrolling platform where you play a squirrel that's got to collect all the nuts on each stage whilst avoiding the enemies. This is a really nice looking game. It's got lovely colourful graphics that look kind of cartoony because they've done high resolution with a black border around everything, along with music and sound effects in game. The problem with this one comes when you're trying to move your squirrel around. It hops along really slowly, but the big issue is with the jumping. Whenever you hit the jump button you do a massive arcing jump that takes forever, to the point where an enemy can appear on the screen and hit you before you actually land. It's also quite difficult to accurately jump from one platform to another, and you find yourself jumping over a platform, landing on the floor and then having to go back and do the same thing again. If you were just able to jump faster or control movement mid-air, it would make the game a hell of a lot more playable. And the final game I want to mention that was the first game that came to mind when I read this question, and that's Star Wars Droids, which was released by Mastertronic in the late 80s. There's obviously already a review of this game on my channel, but the idea is that you control C-3PO and R2-D2 as they try and escape from a prison planet by moving through a number of levels, unlocking force fields, moving up and down using elevators, and dispatching any enemy robots they come across. This was never going to be an amazing game, but it's completely ruined by the decision to use a set of icons across the bottom of the screen to control the characters, rather than just using the joystick directly. What's particularly stupid about this is that most of the icons just correspond to what you'd usually use the joystick for, i.e. left, right, up, down and fire. There's only really one icon that you couldn't have mapped to a joystick control, which is when you're accessing terminals, but that could have easily been done by using the spacebar or a function key. What you find happening in the game is that you move in one direction and then need to turn around quickly to shoot an enemy coming from behind you, and you just can't move the cursor to the required icon quickly enough, so the robots just smash into you, draining your health. As I said, it was never going to be the greatest of games anyway, but I can't understand how that pointless decision made it through playtesting. The next question comes from Voxel.net, who is another big fan of the BBC Micro typing games series, and another one that's given me several super thanks on those videos, so again, thank you very much for those. His question is, do you have any other interests or hobbies other than retro gaming? Do I? Yes, I definitely do. The biggest one, and I have alluded to this several times on the channel in the past, is that I'm a big fan of roller coasters and theme parks, and over the last 10 years I've travelled to many countries to visit the best theme parks and ride some of the finest coasters in the world. At this point in time I've ridden 468 different roller coasters, and my favourite, as I'm sure people are going to want to know since I'm now talking about this topic, is Steel Vengeance at Cedar Point, which is in Ohio in the US. This coaster was manufactured by Rocky Mountain Construction, one of the best respected manufacturers in the business at the moment. It stands 200 foot and is a hybrid of wood and steel, with a wooden support structure supporting steel track. It features 4 inversions, which is where you get flipped upside down, and at the time it was opened it had the most airtime moments of any roller coaster in the world. Airtime is where you get thrown out of your seat basically. I rode it for the first time in 2022 and I hope to go back and ride it sometime again in the future. Aside from roller coasters and theme parks, the other big passion I have other than retro gaming is collecting Star Wars memorabilia. I don't really actually actively collect very much anymore, but I do have a full collection of original Star Wars figures from the 1970s and 80s, and lots of other interesting stuff besides. And if you're interested in seeing that collection, I did do a video about it last year, which I'll put a link to in the corner of the screen now. The other thing I'm interested in that my wife and myself do regularly is travelling, and later this year we're going to be heading on a 3-week trip to Australia and New Zealand, and of course, while I'm there, I'll probably get to ride some roller coasters as well. For the next question I'm going back to Woz, who did ask a second question, which was what in your opinion is the most underrated BBC Micro game? He said that he'd choose Uridium, which is a good conversion and second only to the C64 original. This is a good question, but also quite a difficult one to answer because I think most BBC Micro games are underrated across the broader gaming world, so you might not agree with what I'm about to say depending on how much of a Beeb fan you are. Two games sprung to mind though, and the first of those is a conversion. It's Ultimate's Jetpack, which was obviously originally released on the Spectrum, and this is a very different game in terms of looks on the BBC Micro because it uses Mode 2 and the sprites are huge compared to the Spectrum original, and also a lot more colourful. What that means for the gameplay is that the play area is a lot more cramped, which makes it more difficult I think. Though it is still a very fun and playable game, and I think it probably went under the radar compared to the Spectrum original. The second game I think is quite underrated. It is an original for the BBC Micro. It's the Micropower game Felix Meets the Evil Weevils, which I've covered on a couple of videos before on this channel. It's a single screen platform which I'm sure you know I'm a fan of, but rather than platforms and ladders, you've got conveyor belts and tubes that you have to negotiate to find the spray that you have to use to eliminate the weevils on each stage. It's a pretty hard game, but I also think it has some clever ideas, such as the ability to change the direction of the conveyor belts, and the risk-reward decision of whether to try and let the weevils mutate into faster purple super weevils, to earn yourself more points for eliminating them. There are also bonus letters to collect, a dwindling air supply to top up, and lethal barbarians to avoid. This has all the qualities of a good arcade game, including that high difficulty level, so it's definitely worth a look if you're not familiar with it. Rounding off this first members Q&A session is a question from Cy Hadlington, who's not just a member of my channel but also actually a friend in real life. He asked the question, what is your favourite original Commodore 64 game that you have that's not on a compilation and why? And I came up with 3 answers for this one. The first and most obvious one is Whizball, which I own the original Ocean release of as well as having it on 2 different compilations. It's my all-time favourite Commodore 64 game, and I've covered it on previous videos and will actually be covering it again in an upcoming compilation review video as well, so I won't go into too much detail here, but I'm sure you've heard of it, haven't you, Si? The second game I thought of is Epyx's World Games, which I own a disc version of, which seems to have come from Germany and is in quite a cool clamshell style case. This is my favourite of the Epyx games series and definitely features in my top 10 C64 games too. But the real reason it stands out as a favourite is because for some reason this only cost me £2.50 about 10 years ago, which was a bargain even then. It's always good to have those multi-load Epyx sports games on disc too, isn't it? And the final game is another of my all-time favourites, Bubble Bobble, and this is a US disc version of the game that comes in a large slimline package that looks more like a vinyl record than a computer game. This is branded as a Taito release, but the game itself is the same Software Creations one that we got in the UK, although if I recall correctly, it does have a title screen that's exclusive to this version. It's a pretty cool thing to have in my collection, and I think quite hard to get hold of these days too. That brings my first ever members Q&A video to an end, and I hope all my channel members that asked questions are happy with the answers that they got, and thank you very much for your ongoing support. If anyone else out there has got any thoughts about the things I've said in this video, then let me know in the comments, and if you're interested in becoming a member and asking me a question in a future edition of one of these videos, then click the join button below this video and check out how you can sign up. And if you enjoyed this video, then please give it a like and share it with your friends. I'll be back with more retro gaming content in the near future, so thanks very much for watching this video, and until the next time, see ya!